A Utah polygamist family, the focus of a federal raid today.
That this is the work of the Lord.
Utah's Kingston clan, or the Order, it's also called that, a breakaway Mormon group.
The Order isn't really well known if you're not a part of it, or if you're not in law enforcement, or if you're not involved in some type of, I guess you could call it the polygamist underworld. One of the unique things about the Kingston clan compared to other polygamist groups is that they do live right in the middle of suburban Utah. And the way they do this is by not attracting any attention.
They had something like 100 businesses, including a casino, a rifle manufacturer, and the biodiesel fuel plant that Jacob Kingston set up. Jacob Kingston has 3 wives and 20 children. He grew up poor in Utah, had sort of a hardscrabble life, and was drawn to a very flashy businessman from Los Angeles who drove fast cars, flew around in private jets, and took vacations on yachts. Jacob Kingston was seduced by that lifestyle, and that ultimately led to him leading a much fuller life of crime.
My name is Jesse Hyde. I'm a magazine writer based in Utah.
My name is David Voreacos. I'm a legal reporter at Bloomberg News.
And we wrote The Polygamist Accused of Scamming the U.S. out of $500 million.
Jacob Kingston is part of the Davis County Cooperative Society, also known as the Order. And in the Order, the men are given numbers. There's a hierarchy, and they are expected to tithe their earnings into the church. And the leaders of the church have a very strong hand in how they lead their lives, the choices they make, the wives they choose, the jobs they hold.
One of their early leaders taught a principle that's very common in Mormon fundamentalism called bleeding the beast. Because polygamy is illegal in the U.S., there's a belief that the federal government really is the enemy. And so with many of these groups, there's nothing wrong with figuring out ways to, quote unquote, bleed the beast or fleece the government. The Kingstons over the years have been investigated for tax fraud, child welfare fraud. One of the more common things that former members told me they would do, and they were encouraged to do by their leaders, is a mother would go in and claim that she was a single mom with 7 kids to qualify for different benefits, when in fact she could have been the 3rd or 4th wife of a husband.
Over the past few years, members of the Kingston family who ran a different company called Washakie Renewable Energy have pleaded guilty to dozens of charges, including fraud, money laundering, and obstruction.
Jacob Kingston, from what I understand, actually had the idea to build this biodiesel production plant. He recognized that there was a huge opportunity. The federal government was really pushing renewable energy, alternative fuels, and there were big tax credits you could get. Prior to Jacob, they had sort of focused on businesses like pawn shops, or, commercial property that's kind of shabbier. Jacob was taking them into the big leagues where, he's standing courtside at halftime at a Utah Jazz game presenting a big check to a charity. So this really was a matter of moving from the shadows into the public arena. You could almost think of like The Godfather or any sort of mafia movie where over time, you want to go into legitimate business. You don't want to live in the shadows anymore.
After Jacob Kingston got his PhD in engineering, he then set up a plant in northern Utah on his father's ranch. What they did was produce biodiesel fuel, which takes animal fat, or used cooking oil, and through a chemical process converts it into a type of fuel that works in trucks and in manufacturing facilities. The pure version of that fuel is known as B100. And what they then did was apply for tax credits that are administered by both the Environmental Protection Agency and the Internal Revenue Service. Those tax credits were $1 a gallon for the fuel that they produced that was B100, or what's called B99, a slightly diluted version. And they also got credit for a renewable identification number, or a RIN, R-I-N, and that was $1 a gallon as well. And those are sort of a unique number that can be traded between companies.
Washakie Renewable Energy, a proud partner of the Tour of Utah, is leading the Intermountain West to a future where our air is clear, clean, and healthy.
It did start as a legitimate business. Kingston found that he could not compete because of the limitations on his location and the difficulties in producing the material. So he began to cut corners and cheat the way other people in the industry did as well.
In 2011, Washakie had run into some troubles. The biodiesel they were creating, called B99, was being rejected. It wasn't pure enough. And so he was looking for someone to buy it. And so he had sent a salesman out to people who were involved in this business who might buy it. And that's how he came across Lev Durman. And that was the beginning of what initially was a really profitable enterprise for both of them. Lev Durman, who called himself the Lion, was a man who, you could say, a self-made immigrant who created an oil and gas empire in Southern California. And in his adult life, he was constantly under investigation. And we talked to one of his associates who said that the first time he met Lev, he was struck by a guy who was almost like wearing a costume of a mobster. He was wearing blue alligator shoes, a blue alligator belt. You know, he had an office in Rodeo Drive, and it was like, hey, let's go down here for a meal. You know, my chauffeur will take us, and, you know, it's like a block away. But, hey, if I can get into my Rolls Royce and take you a block, and the restaurant's shut down just for me, that's going to create this appearance that I am, I don't know, like an organized crime boss. And so he sort of carried himself that way. It's a question of how much of that was just for appearance and how much of that was real.
When they first met, Lev Durman flew his private jet to Utah to meet Jacob Kingston and his wife Sally. Durman then flew them to Seattle to meet a friend of his. He wined them and dined them. The Kingstons had never been wined and dined before. They'd never been on a private jet. They went to a seafood store, and Lev Durman bought the entire contents of the seafood store to bring home for the Kingstons. Over time, Jacob Kingston was dazzled by Lev Durman's fast-living lifestyle. They bought very expensive sports cars, like a $1.8 million Bugatti for Lev Durman. They bought a waterfront house in California for Lev Durman. They bought a $3 million house in Utah for Jacob Kingston. They took trips together. He started dressing in a flashier way, started wearing cologne. He started cutting his hair differently.
It really started to change him. He got a taste for the high life, and he wanted that. And in pursuing that, he was sort of breaking an unspoken order rule. And that rule is to not draw attention. If you start wearing flashy suits and driving fancy cars and having a luxury suite at Utah Jazz games, being public with your company, sponsoring different things, you're going to draw attention. And so Jacob had a dilemma. Do we keep operating the way my uncles have run the family by staying in the shadows? Or do we go big? Do we try to make a lot of money? And for whatever reason, he chose the latter.
The EPA did not enforce its standards stringently, and what fraudsters soon learned is that if they were able to produce documentation that showed that they had produced biodiesel fuel, that the government accepted that documentation and they got, their credits. Eventually, the government got more sophisticated at rooting out the fraudsters, but there were several years, particularly in the early years, Jacob Kingston and Lev Durman perpetrating their fraud, that the government was not able to keep up with the fraudsters. So there was one particular fraud where the Kingstons and Lev Durman used a supplier in Florida and Houston who shipped B99 on a barge and sent it to the east coast of Panama, and that generated phony paperwork. And then they trucked it over to the west coast of Panama, then they put it on a different boat and shipped it up to Los Angeles, where Lev Durman's company said that he was shipping it to Utah for processing at Kingston biodiesel fuel plant, the Washakie plant.
I talked to a guy who worked for Jacob, and he told me that they filled up an entire rail car with water. As long as they had the documents to show that they were moving what looked like biodiesel, the inspections were so lax to basically like non-existent, but that was enough to fool the government and cash in on these tax credits.
The largest and most dramatic example were two checks combined totaled more than $160 million. That was ultimately their biggest payday. There were other claims that they put in that were disallowed as the government eventually caught on fully to their fraud. Jacob Kingston and his family were arrested as they boarded a plane in Salt Lake City headed for Turkey.
Anything you'd like to say?
My client's not going to have any.
A lot of the initial questions that prosecutors were starting to ask kind of tipped their hand that this wasn't going to just be a case about Washakie Renewable Energy. This was going to be a case about the order and all of their businesses, and this would put everything they had built at risk. So in a way, Jacob took this big gamble for the family. Let's go big time, let's step out of the shadows, let's make a lot of money. And at the end, he paid the ultimate price.
Yeah, that's right. The Kingston clan has their fingers in all kinds of businesses. Oil lubes, grocery stores, hardware stores, private investigator firms, biodiesel. And that biodiesel allegedly helped pay for that $4 million mansion in Sandy, where one of those warrants was served today.
The prosecutors were helped at trial by the cooperation of 5 people who had pleaded guilty and testified under cooperation agreements. They included Jacob Kingston and his younger brother Isaiah. Prosecutors showed at trial that they made nearly $500 million and that the claims accelerated at the end of the fraud. He then sent through a very complex financial path tens of millions of dollars to Lev Durman.
Now to an Eyewitness News investigation and the strange alliance between a suspected mobster here in LA and a polygamist clan in Utah.
Lev Durman was convicted in March of 2020 after a 6-week trial of conspiracy, money laundering, and fraud charges. Durman's lawyer complained that the jurors panicked and reached a quick decision only because they were scared about COVID-19 and they wanted to get out of there.
I've known my client for decades, and I'm confident that when he tells me he did nothing wrong, that he's telling the truth.
The second phase of Lev Durman's criminal trial will be a forfeiture proceeding that begins later this year, in which the government is trying to recover assets that they say were the product of money laundering. Both Lev Durman and Jacob Kingston are in jail around Salt Lake City. Neither has been sentenced. Lev Durman faces life in prison. Jacob Kingston also faces many years in prison, but as a result of his cooperation and the successful conviction of Lev Durman, it's likely that he would get far less time than he ultimately could face for the crimes he admitted in pleading guilty. The Kingston fraud was the largest biodiesel fuel fraud in U.S. history. More than 30 cases, no one had been accused of the level of fraud that they engaged in, that they admitted engaging in.